And now, a conversation on Africa's startup ecosystem. Please welcome founder and general partner of Future Africa, Iyinoluwa Aboyeji, Chief Sustainability Officer and Chairperson of Jumia Nigeria, Juliet Anammah, Managing Partner of Lateral Capital, Grin, hosted by Semafor Africa Editor, Yinka Adegoke.
Okay, thank you everyone for still being here in the afternoon. I often worry that everyone's gone home after lunch, but thank you for still being here. So on this panel we have people who've done really impressive work across the continent when it comes to investing, particularly obviously in startups. And we thought we'd have a conversation about how things are changing quite rapidly. Stephen, I was talking to you earlier, and you suggested maybe a way to frame the question is to think about whether the party has ended because cheap interest rates are no longer available, and the world has forgotten about Africa because the money is not as cheap as it once was. I mean, how do you see things now?
Yeah, thanks, Yinka, so much for the question. One of my investors asked me the other day, is the party over? And how much of the sort of run-up in the velocity of money coming to Africa was sort of profligate spending and, interest rates at zero. And, my response to him is that the party's actually just starting. And now is really the time for Africa-focused funds that have, domain presence, that are in market, and for founders to build. Like now is sort of the right meeting point because other things have emerged in the ecosystem that really sort of foundationally cement, I think, what we three here, fundamentally believe in. One is the talent pool has gotten deeper and steeper, right? There's an explosion of talent now that are sort of 2-3x founders. There's been a bifurcation in the ecosystem around sort of where investors have domain experience to play. Right, there's a professionalized angel community. Right. There's obviously professional seed funds. There's professional Series A, Series B growth funds, obviously as well as tourist dollars coming in. So, in our view, we're tracking over $1.2 billion of captive Africa venture dollars that are now have been committed to funds. And if you're in the asset management business like I am, I don't know many fund managers who give money back. So that money's there to be deployed. And so, one of the many reasons we're still continuing to be quite bullish from a valuation perspective, from a founder perspective, to continue to support the African venture space.
What's your take? I'm going to go to the VC guys first before I ask.
I think it was a beautiful launch party, right? So we got people on the continent. We got the global attention. We proved a couple people wrong. I remember it wasn't that long ago that people would say it wasn't possible to build a $100 million company in Africa. We built a couple $1 billion companies. We showed the world what African talent is capable of. Zero interest rate fueled launch party. Maybe that's over. But then, the building a business has now started. And I think this is the time very much, like my colleague has said, this is the time for us to now start building. But I think the most important question to answer is, what are we building for? Because an ecosystem has to have a very clear purpose underlying it's the investments. And if it's just the relentless pursuit of profits, I don't know whether that leads us anywhere different from where we've been. I mean, I don't think we're in a world where people have the luxury of just having a good time.
How do you say from the sort of the operational
part of it? Yes. I mean, The question I ask is, what was the party about in the first place? It was always about opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't a frothy opportunity, as you can...
There was a real need.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you can tell from that word froth, I am not a big believer in crypto. So it was about real problems that people had, right? I mean, if you take a country like Nigeria, 200 million people, but GDP per capita, income per capita is 1/3 of Peru or Brazil. So what's the gap? It's productivity gap, right? So it's that productivity gap that's driving the need for those solutions that need to come into play. So yes, there's been a break in the party. Everyone's just gone back, grab a drink, catch a breath, and then come back and start to look at what are the real solutions that we need to go after. And then for those solutions, be very deliberate in terms of not just the solutions that solve the core problem, but within the ecosystem, like Iyi said, what are the other things that we need to put in place? There's a lot of innovation around product that needs to happen, but also around process and around regulatory innovation as well. So those combinations are what I call part of the full ecosystem that you need to ensure that all of that is available to make a success of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, what has been your experience? And I'll stay with you, Juliet, because obviously Jumia has, it's kind of like, as they often, what's this tagline? Amazon of Africa,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. But regardless of how one views it, it's clearly a pioneering company.
Yeah.
And that is, got people interested, made people aware that, e-commerce is even a thing that's possible. Yourselves and Conga at the time. What has been the sort of the experience when people have expectations that things would just go the way it went in Silicon Valley, rather than thinking about, well, actually, these are the problems we need to solve.
Yeah, the way the analogy I like to use is that of when you launch a rocket, right? It has to go at a certain speed to go against the pull of gravity, right? And the lighter it is, then the faster it can move and get to that velocity. You need to recognize that the African environment is totally different. So just taking from our experience in Jumia, it's not just you're building the core solution, which is around e-commerce. You're trying to build a marketplace for how consumers can interact with sellers. At the same time, you need to recognize that the sellers who are interacting with these consumers may not be as digitally literate as the rest of the organization, right? That's backing that company, or even the consumers. And therefore, you need to invest in things like training, like, even down to providing logistics network for them. Payment services, you need to realize that in an African environment, don't expect it's going to be 100% prepaid, right? There has to be some element of postpaid in that environment. So those kinds of nuances are very much an African environmental factor. So those are African environmental factors that come into play. And you need to build a model that recognizes all of them. Right? Now, having said that, it is still worth it, because at the end of the day, once you scale it, then you get the real value out of it.
And that's the challenge, right? Being able to scale, being able to scale these things. Let me come back to Eve first on this idea of, we had a conversation once where you talked about this idea of, like, some of the money that was coming in was trying to solve Silicon Valley problems rather than African problems. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it kind of ties in with the same idea. Like, there's all these cheap monies come in, and it seems to be addressing other people's needs rather than the needs of people on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer to be more charitable in public.
I'm a journalist, I can't be.
Okay, I have to, I'm raising money, so I have to be careful. But but the honest truth is, I think money has a point of view. So when Silicon Valley was coming to invest, and of course we're grateful for the money, they had a point of view about what the continent was and how it worked. And obviously, this point of view is patched together from slide decks, slick guys like me coming to pitch, 15 minutes in the country, like it's a nice story, and that's what we focused on. But it's not necessarily the entire reality of investing in Africa, right? And the reality is many of them, sometimes we were ourselves learning what the market was. I can tell you, even with some of the businesses we built, like Flutterwave or Andela, where we partnered with Silicon Valley or New York Capital, as the case may be, there were elements of it that we discovered in person, how important regulation was. We only discovered that in real time. You know what I mean? There was a time I thought you could ignore government. Now I'm best buddies with all the politicians. So there's a lot of paradigm shifting moments that come with the experience of the last decade. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But now I think the honest truth is the bar is so high now that you got to come in with real partners. And I think that's what Silicon Valley is yet to understand. You cannot fly by and invest. You got to find somebody who's dedicated, working with you on the ground to be able to invest. And the problems that we're trying to solve are a layer deeper than building the PayPal of Africa. Yeah. They're now very deep problems. We're talking about, how do you build a proper counterbalance to local currency? We're talking about macro issues. We're talking about real infrastructure. We're talking about building talent in millions of people at scale, meaning, getting into the education system. We're talking about collaborating with government, in order to build something that's super scalable and has the right regulatory frameworks. You're talking about changing the financial system. So the goals are much higher. The reach is much bigger. The opportunity also is much bigger. But at the same time, you're not gonna, if you wanna keep doing what you've done the last decade as a Silicon Valley investor, and you think you're gonna make money in Africa over the next decade, well, I don't know what to tell you.
Stephen, what needs to change about that Silicon Valley investor, based on what he is saying? How does that person's approach need to be different, needs to change?
First get on a plane and go visit and understand the market. That's the start. Mm-hmm. You've seen the emergence of a few historically US-only funds now begin to raise dedicated pools for the continent, and I think hire the right team to execute on this. And I think that's great. I think, again, in the pool of money that represents investing in EM, investing in Africa, it's great to have tier one US VC funds there. Sentiment drives our markets. It will always drive our markets around valuation and talent and everything else. I think there's also the notion of what E was just touching on, which is, big ideas or really pretty storyboards hitting brick walls very quickly, right? So a company goes from 0 to 4 million customer accounts in the span of 6 months using very little dollars. And then from 4 to 6 million customers to 20 is an impossibility. And then how do you squeeze ARPU? How do you squeeze revenue out of that customer base is next to impossible. And I think that's what Silicon Valley is misunderstood, is that, you have a law of big numbers, but big numbers don't actually translate into real meaningful unit economics. And that's a good lesson for them to learn. Right? I think it's a lesson I think we all appreciate, understand, and perhaps why our portfolios look quite different. But whether that money is fickle or not with respect to the next cycle we go into, again, is really irrelevant for the perspective that there now is a market, there is now proof points, there is now capital, real institutional capital behind the momentum that we've all played a small part in building. And when I look at the next wave of that stack that's going to get built, I get very excited for creator economy opportunities. What's going on around music and sports and entertainment. I'm incredibly bullish on this idea that crypto will actually prove its value significantly in the market, and would love to talk about that and sort of what are the bright spots around the talent base. The talent base and the problems that they're trying to solve.
Yeah. Just to wrap up quickly with you, Juliet. So do What's given your experience over the last decade, particularly with e-commerce, what advice are you giving to a founder or even an investor, like one of these guys that comes to you and says, we want to back an e-commerce business on the continent, particularly in the key, if you think Nigeria, Kenya, one of these larger markets?
Yeah, I think, it would be the same thing I would tell, even if they were in healthcare or education or, any of the other areas where we have, those similar opportunities as we do in e-commerce. I think the models of today going forward would have to incorporate a number of things. So, you're building your product stack. That's fantastic. Okay. You're building the ecosystem that supports it, be it the relationship with the banks, with the fintechs, and co that need to support your product and how you deliver your product in the environment. There's a third component, and that component is what I call collaboration. Okay, you've got to get out of your silo, which is I'm working on my company, I'm focused on my market environment, I'm focused on my relationship with regulators and my relationship with competitors in the market, my customers, my sellers, and so on. Break out of that entire silo and look across the bridge to see who else is doing what in the market that I could find real collaborative opportunities to work with. Because the more you can work with others to work and develop solutions or processes or whatever for certain parts of the business, of the entire ecosystem that may not be core, but if you don't fix them, they will slow your rate of growth, the better. And I think also that's extremely important when you have, that's the other lesson for Silicon Valley also in my view is when you're coming in, when you're investing, think from the perspective of not just the entity, but what are the other types of partnerships and collaborations that we can bring to the table for them to grow faster and scale faster. That's the third component that I would really recommend.
It's almost like enabling capacity,
to
speak. Right? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you talk a little bit about? One of the things I think is interesting when we talk about the slowdown, right? Because venture funding in Africa has actually exceeded last year. In 2022, it exceeded last year, 2021. So. But I imagine, obviously when we talk about this, to something that Stephen said earlier, it's kind of like the sentiment of it, right? We can feel it in the market. It feels like things are slowing down. Mm-hmm. Last week, you unveiled a new fund, which was sort of using debt instead of equity. Can you talk a little bit about how the movement in the markets is affected your thinking about using debt as a funding mechanism?
Well, we're less sentiment aligned as a fund. I think we tend to feel these things a lot earlier than most people because we're so grassroots. We have 100 portfolio companies. So if any big wave is coming, we probably saw it 3 quarters ago. We largely stopped investing in Q2 of 2022 with radically slow down our investing because we could already see like a big iceberg with valuations and where it was going and all that. Now, the lesson we learned with venture debt...
Just to be clear, you mean as in like the valuations were out of control?
Yes. At that point, the valuations were insane. Okay. And, Silicon Valley was just pumping in money. So we're wondering what's going on. We figured it wouldn't last forever. So we slowed down investing and switched a bunch of stuff just so we could stay in market but not be active. Now, for venture debt, we fell in love with venture debt actually because of the first investment we made out of our last fund, this final quarter of the fund, which was Move, which is an incredible company that essentially helps mobility entrepreneurs to get an asset-backed loan that allows them to drive their way to ownership of a car. And the business started in Lagos with these 2 incredible entrepreneurs, Ladia and Jide, and then has scaled globally, actually. It's in Dubai, it's in London, it's in India, it's all over the world. And we saw the power of venture debt, right? The real power of asset-backed finance in its ability to allocate to problems at scale in a way that venture can't do except without messing up your unit economics, right? In a significant way. And we started to become very big believers. And we wrote an article about venture debt being the future of finance. And what we did, because we're not bankers, was we started to advocate, but more importantly, we started to package our companies in such a way that we would be able to position them for venture debt. And that led us to learn a lot, right? So the first thing we learned was actually there's not a lot of in-depth financial planning analysis talent in the market. So a lot of these companies are receiving tens of millions of dollars and they have an accountant as opposed to a finance person. And obviously that's what you see when the company shuts down because there's not enough precision with the financial modeling. And there are a bunch of other things, you know, African banks are useless, for example. Something else we learned was how to manage currency risk.
Right.
So there are many, many interesting lessons we learned from that adventure in venture debt. And also that development capital, venture debt is where development capital can be most catalytic because, you know, development finance won't wake up in the morning below certain check sizes. And, you know, the capacity for venture debt is infinite. You know, I've lost count of how much venture debt Move has raised. But because there's all these ability to recycle capital and it's very clear where the money is going and the financial structures are clear and all that, you can actually see things flow in a very great way. And with technology, the experience is actually amazing because you can actually see the money going in real time. You don't have to hope that somebody didn't just take your money and move it to Switzerland. Without telling you stories, you can see which cars it went to. You can see, you know, whether it was women. You can see whether they're paying back in real time because it's all built around technology, a technology-driven asset management model. So we partnered up with TLG, and it's not exclusive. It's one of many partnerships to basically now build out this venture debt offering so that startups can start building on the back of venture debt. And it's perfect timing because even the equity investors are rewarding great unit economics now. So we're like, look, regardless of whether you want to raise debt or equity, you kind of need to figure out how this portion of financing works. So why don't we help you so that whatever you choose to do, you can do it. Second of all, ownership is very important. And, I was talking to Aubrey, my friend. I was like, how do I tell the world I didn't make that much money on Flutterwave, right? Because everybody seems to think I'm a billionaire. But, you know, the reality is, you know, our investors made way more money than I did, at least, right? For a bunch of reasons. And, you know, if I was doing any business again, I'm probably thinking there were things I could have done better with venture debt so that I could own more of the company. And I don't want the next generation I generally don't care about money, but like, I figure the next generation of entrepreneurs should probably have a slightly better experience. And you know, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing in all of this is if you care about impact and not just a large fundraise announcement, right? You're looking for capital sources that are aligned with impact. And every dollar that goes out when it comes to venture debt or even equity, which is used to set up venture debt, you can account for from an impact perspective. A car is an entrepreneur, right? And that entrepreneur earns money that he can use to take care of his family. And you can track that direct dollar somewhere. Now, when you put equity in a company, you don't know whether 95% of it is going to pay for expensive engineers in Europe or Silicon Valley. So anyway, that's...
No, unfortunately, we've run out of time.
I'm sorry.
I know you're passionate about this.
I'm passionate about venture debt.
Please join me in thanking my excellent panel on Silicon Valley.
Thank you.
Thank you.